Here come those tears again, just when I was getting over you, just when I was gonna make it through another night without missing you, thinking I might just be strong enough after all. When I hear your footsteps
Yeah, I want to hear the chorus because I like the chorus, but we got to get going here. We got work to do. And so today's show is about crying, first of all. And as a lot of you know, I understand almost everything. I process almost everything through movies and television. So when we first started thinking about a show about crying, one of my first thoughts was to the movie Broadcast News, in which crying is a really interesting kind of almost subplot as opposed to a subtext. The Holly Hunter character, a woman trying to make it in a pretty male-dominated profession of network news producing, has this little ritual, habit, practice, I don't know what to call it, but she'll arrange to be alone in a bathroom or in her own home or whatever, and she kind of looks in the window and she produces this kind of convulsive sob. And by the time you're done with the movie, you realize that she thinks she needs to do this at some point, but she also thinks she needs to do it not in front of men who may use it against her. That's never said. It's a completely unspoken thing. There's no explanation or commentary ever offered in the movie about the fact that she's doing that. But then running on a parallel track is the William Hurt character, who's this kind of slick, charismatic anchorman. And we see him ultimately interviewing a woman about a very emotionally fraught situation. They're sitting in chairs facing one another, and she's describing what happened to her. And he cries. A tear rolls down his cheek. And then they find out afterwards that there wasn't a camera rolling on him when that happened. And that's too bad. They lost that moment. And he says, oh, no, just put the camera on me. I can do it again. And he just sits there and he produces the tear. And you start to realize that you cannot trust this man. You can't trust this man on a bunch of different levels, including the fact that he will put something on the news that isn't real. That was back decades ago when that was considered kind of a problem. But also you can't trust somebody who can just produce tears on command like that. The other movie that I thought of was Blade Runner. And, there's that scene with Rutger Hauer as Roy Batty near the end, and he's standing in the rain. And other streaks are clearly coming down his cheeks. And he says, I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. Attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion. I watched as sea beams glittered in the dark near the Tannhauser Gate. All those moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain. Time to die. And he's a replicant, and he's clearly producing something resembling tears. And a whole big set of questions about emotions and humanity kind of get called into question right there. So with all of that, let's talk to the person who actually knows something and wrote something about that. The author of Cry Baby, Why Our Tears Matter. Benjamin Perry is with us. And hello, welcome to our show.
Hey, Colin. Thanks so much for having me on.
So, first of all, it's a great book, and it kind of does what we like books to do on this show, which is look at something from a lot of different perspectives. I should say Benjamin Perry is a minister at Middle Church. And this begins with a little sort of personal anecdote of yours, which was you went through a period where you either couldn't or at least didn't cry, and you started to wonder whether that was a good thing.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that you started the show talking about tears in fiction, because one of the really interesting things I see in the way that authors and filmmakers use tears in the stories they tell is to mark periods of transformation.
Mm-hmm.
That the tears often happen at these pivotal moments where a character is changing and the creator is using the tears to show this outward manifestation of an inward transformation. And when I look back on my own life, I see that play out actually in my own emotional reality. So, from the time I was in sort of late middle school, maybe fifth or sixth grade, all the way until when I was in seminary in my early 20s, I didn't cry once. And I had a professor in seminary who invited us to reflect on the last time we had wept as part of a classroom exercise. And I realized that I just didn't have any memory that I could attach to this incredibly core human experience beyond, some early childhood ones. And yeah, it was this moment that cast in stark relief that there was something inside me that had broken, and it's what started this absurd 6-month experiment where I forced myself to cry every day to try to recover something that I had lost.
So there's a lot of things going on when we cry, and you cover all of them, really. But there's some things biologically that go on when we're crying. I was fascinated to know that the tears that we might just express as a physical reaction are different from the tears that we express as an emotional reaction in terms of their actual chemical composition. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so that research comes from this guy, William Frey, who published this book in the mid-'80s called Crying: The Mystery of Tears. And for that, one of the things that he did was he had participants, throw an onion in a wearing blender and, cry those chemical tears that you cry after, chopping onions. And he compared the chemical composition of those tears to tears he collected by making folks watch Brian's song. And then he would, collect the tears that people cried watching that movie. And he compared the two kinds of tears, both emotional tears and physical tears. And what he found was that the protein concentration in emotional tears was about 20% higher, and that specifically the kinds of proteins that were present in higher levels in emotional tears than in the rest of the bloodstream were neurotransmitters that are frequently linked to stress. And so his hypothesis was that the tear ducts were actually acting as an excretory function and collecting these proteins at a higher concentration from the brain, from the bloodstream, and excreting them through the eyes.
So because we are a full-service radio show, we asked Chef Plum, host of the show Seasoned and Restaurant Road Trip, about this whole onions making us cry thing. So these are the non-emotional tears. Kat, this is A1.
Okay, so first, let's talk why onions make us cry. Onions grow underground and can have all kinds of little small critters who want to snack on them. So as a defense, when the skin of an onion is broken, it spews these enzymes and a type of acid. And when these two combine, it forms a gas called propantheol S oxide. Yes, I know that's a big word for me, Colin. I know. I can't spell it. Don't ask me to. Anyway, when it reaches our face and it mixes with that water layer that protects our eyes, it turns into, get this, a sulfuric acid. Seriously, basically burning our eyes. So naturally, our bodies produce tears to make that burning stop. All right, so let's talk fixing the problem. You could wear goggles, but that looks insane. Can you imagine walking into a kitchen and everyone's cutting onions and wearing goggles? It feels like a terrible movie. You could cut them in a clear box with holes in it for your hands, but who has time for that? What I recommend? Put a lemon wedge in your mouth. I'm serious. Put a lemon wedge in your mouth while you're cutting the onions. It works, I swear. It's something to do with raising the acid level and maybe for me, just keeping my mind off the fact that I'm cutting an onion. Also, if you chill the onions in the freezer for a few minutes ahead of time before you cut them, it can slow that initial chemical reaction. And finally, if you do find yourself tearing up like the first time we all heard Taylor Swift's All Too Well, stop cutting and put your head in the freezer. It will make the crying stop immediately. Seriously, you'll look a little crazy, but the crying will stop immediately. All right, good luck, friends, and I'm going to go figure out how to get this Taylor Swift song out of my head now. See you later.
All right, so useful advice about that. But Benjamin Perry, to me, one of the most interesting things to explore in your book and then to prepare for this show is just the incredibly complex and often paradoxical attitudes we have about crying, and particularly sort of in gendered contexts. If in Plato's Republic, there's this whole thing where Socrates and somebody else, I forget who, they have this big conversation about all the crying in Homer, in the Iliad. Because in the Iliad, the warriors cry all the time. When they're not fighting, they're crying. That's like the two things they really do a lot. And they're thinking, this isn't really good, and men shouldn't do this, and we don't want our young men seeing all this crying. Maybe we should do like a tear-free edit of the Iliad. But and I think that goes on over and over again. We see that. I want to sort of divide this up into men and women. With men, sometimes that is a sign of weakness, but it's also paradoxically a sign of strength in a lot of specific situations. I don't know. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think you bringing up the Iliad is a perfect example also of the way that cultural reaction to crying has changed dramatically over time. That if you look at other ancient texts like the Bible or something like Gilgamesh and some of the other ancient religious epics that we still have copies of, you'll see very frequently that people are crying as a sign of strength, as a sign of their passion, of their willingness to feel deeply, their love for their friends. Jesus famously weeps when Lazarus has died right before he raises him. There are all these stories that don't make any sense unless you understand that an ancient audience was looking at these stories as an example of tears being this sign of strength. Now, fast forward a couple thousand years, and what was really fascinating when I was doing the interviews for the book is I interviewed all kinds of people because I wanted this book to, contain more stories about crying than I have in my own body. And what I heard was this seemingly universal refrain from all these different people I talked to, that they had all the shame that they carried in their bodies around tears. But what was really fascinating was that the shame was coming from different places. So yeah, for men, I would hear a lot about, role models that they grew up with, telling them that it wasn't manly to cry. There's an interview I love in my book. This guy who grew up on a West Texas ranch, whose grandfather's adage was "Cowboys don't cry." He would tell him that, anytime he was starting to tear up, "Cowboys don't cry." But then I would talk to women, and I would hear, the same discomfort with crying publicly because of the way that they would be perceived as less professional or less competent. I would hear from Black folks talking about the ways that crying in largely white spaces would they felt affirm some of the prejudices that people already carried about Black people being too emotional. I heard from the children of first-gen immigrants who talked about the way that their parents thought that crying just wasn't going to be tough enough in a world that had expected them to be very, very tough just in order to survive. And so even though all these people came from these different social locations, they shared this common experience of having this core part of their humanity suppressed.
Yeah, and I think there's sort of a way in which at an abstract level, there are all these rules. And then in the real life, we react very differently to them. Yes, cowboys don't cry, and big athletes don't cry. And Tom Hanks famously says to all the women in A League of Our Own, "There's no crying in baseball." But let's hear Mike Schmidt, the famous third baseman for the Phillies, give his attempt to give his retirement speech. A2 Cat.
Some 18 years ago, I left Dayton, Ohio, with 2 very bad knees. And a dream to become a Major League Baseball player. I thank God that the dream came true.
So, Benjamin Perry, there's sort of a needle whose eye you can get through, right? If you're a man, there are situations where, some people did make fun of Mike Schmidt for that, but for the most part, if you're like a big, tough athlete or these days a politician in a lot of situations, you can cry and people think that's good. You're a human being. It's okay. You're a big, strong guy and you let us see you cry.
Well, and I think that the tide is actually turning a little bit more broadly. And so even though a lot of us still have this fear that we carry around, if I cry, people are going to react in a negative way. Most of the time when I talk to people or when I have, cried openly in my own life, that's actually not how most people respond. I think that when we cry openly, oftentimes it gives other people an invitation to own their own vulnerability, to, give people the privilege of crying second.
Yeah, I found the same thing. I've cried really openly blubbering twice on this radio show. And each time I thought, oh my God, what are people going to think? Well, they either didn't think anything or they thought it was fine. It was appropriate to be crying at that moment.
They reached out and they said, oh my God, I really needed that. The piece of that clip that you played that's so interesting to me is as you hear him start to cry, the other thing you hear is all of those cameras clicking because there is such power in tears. And we know that on a deep, visceral level. When we see somebody else crying, it changes the space. It's not the same as it was before.
Right. So I think it is different for women. It's got just a different set of blades to it. So I'm going to take you back. I think, quite a bit older than you are. I'm going to take you back to 1987. Patricia Schroeder, who had been thought of and had been sort of starting to seek the nomination for a presidential run on a Democratic ticket, had decided that she wasn't going to do it. This is the speech she gave when she announced she was withdrawing from the field. This is A3 Cat.
I could not figure out how to run and not be separated from those I serve. There must be a way, but I haven't figured it out yet. Summer's contacts were warm and wonderful, The spontaneity was terrific. And I could not bear to turn every human contact into a photo opportunity, nor could I bear to be separated by people who were well-meaning, but trying to protect me. I would shrivel.
So as crying goes, it's weird because I remembered that as like really extreme crying because the press, of which I was a part at the time, covered this as this instance where a woman politician really kind of broke down in public. And if you watch the clip, her husband is there saying, "I need to take a break, maybe just catch your breath or something." And you know, it was really seen as maybe this was a step backwards for women in politics, and some women political commentators and women politicians were saying that. It was also, is that how she's going to deal with Kim Jong-il or whoever the tough guy was at the moment? And that same kind of questioning came up a little bit decades later when in New Hampshire, Hillary Clinton cried, although that time it was kind of more like maybe we needed to see that from her. Maybe we needed to see a human side of somebody who seems a little mechanistic sometimes. But women just pay a different set of prices, and there are just a different set of valences. But I'd love to know your thoughts.
Yeah, that Hillary Clinton clip was the first thing that came to my mind when you were playing the other. Because similarly, you know, if you remember back to the way that the press covered it, in your memory, you're like, oh my God, she must have been bawling given the huge fervor that was made over her tears. But if you go back and watch that clip, it's like a tiny little tear starts to run down her cheek.
Yeah.
And even that semblance of a tear was enough to create, I mean, people literally, I forget which of the New York Times columnists offhand, but somebody actually asked that question verbatim. Is she going to cry around Kim Jong-un? That was an actual question someone was asking, like, this campaign stop was going to be the same as a negotiation with a dictator.
I think Maureen Dowd,
yes.
Yeah, she might have reported that somebody else said it or something.
And so I think that you have, you know, this very clear picture of the razor's edge on which women's tears fall. I did a number of interviews in the book with some of my wife's former coworkers at a media company who all reported crying in this one stairwell in their office. And the office was so abusive that people were crying all the time, that everybody felt like they couldn't do it publicly. And so they would go to the stairwell, and sometimes you would go to the stairwell and there would already be somebody crying there and you would have to go find somewhere else. But the thing that kills me is this was a company that was almost entirely women, founded as an overt and explicit reaction to sort of male-dominated media spaces. And yet you still have these very patriarchal paradigms that govern people's self-expression in that kind of place. And so, yeah, I think that, you know, many women do on average cry much more than men. On average, most women are emotionally healthier, are more able to talk about and put names to their emotions and have a better relationship with their tears. And yet in a workplace that has so often been created in such a way that crying is implicitly a form of weakness, whereas, you know, yelling in anger is a strength, you have these emotionally healthy people who are forced to suppress a core part of their humanity in order to fit into a paradigm that ultimately doesn't serve anybody.
Right. So I'm going to read you a quote from, we polled our listeners a lot on social media about this. We got an email from Lori saying, there should be more public crying. We should be able to go out shopping and see people crying because the store is out of mayonnaise. We should be able to go to work and cry whenever the situation warrants it. Why? Because people wouldn't yell at each other so much if they cried more freely. Give me your short thought about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, the book actually started because it was the beginning of the pandemic, and I was watching them park morgue trucks outside my window. I lived right next to Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in Washington Heights, and there were so many people dying that they didn't have enough room in the morgue. And yet, while all of this was happening, everyone was like, oh, it's time to get back to work, time to go back to the office. And it was this bizarre and violent juxtaposition between the overt and overwhelming suffering that I was physically watching, hearing sirens going all day, and this liturgy of normalcy that we were all, you know, enraptured and enthralled by. And so I wanted to write a book that would help invite people to name the grief that they were carrying, to help other people name theirs, to make some space to talk about all the pain that so often goes unmentioned. And I think that really, if we do talk about that kind of pain, the listener is absolutely right. that's the first step towards unraveling some of the other emotions that we layer over our hurt, things like anger, because we're afraid of going into that painful place.
Yeah, and I think also there's a way in which, and you read a lot about this, how crying also is a social signal to people that something is real, that something is, I mean, Obama crying after Sandy Hook is a way of saying to the world, this is something that happened, it's real, it has significance, we should be reacting to it the way you react to a great tragedy.
Yeah, it's humanizing in the fullest sense of the word. When someone tells you that thing that you're experiencing, you're not just imagining it. All the pain that you have been moving through, that isn't some figment of your emotional life, that is tied to a real thing that has been happening. And the other piece of the social, that humanizing force, is that when we see other people cry, on average, we are moved towards care and towards compassion. And that's an evolutionary thing. It's part of the reason why evolutionary psychologists believe we cry in the first place, as a visible signal to solicit aid, because humans are so based in these mutually beneficial non-kin relationships. That's what makes us distinct. What makes us unique and beautiful and wondrous is our ability to provide care beyond the people we are immediately related to. And crying invites that kind of collective response.
So, first of all, the book is wonderful. It's called Cry, Baby, Why Our Tears Matter. Benjamin Perry, my guest, is the author of the book. We've just scratched the surface of the stuff that's in there. I encourage you to get out there and read it. Meanwhile, we did ask our listeners other questions about this, and we received this voicemail from Caitlin responding to our question about what made you cry recently. This is A4CAT.
My husband is currently on his first military deployment, and it's been a little bit tough for us. And something that has made me cry is any time that I am driving into work and I hear a love song or just any kind of song about a relationship, something that didn't used to make me cry at all, now makes me cry a lot. And I've learned to try to avoid those songs because I don't want to show up to work with baggy, puffy red eyes. So yeah, that's all that I have. Thank you. Bye-bye.
And we're going to take a break, and we will come back to have a conversation very specifically about music and how it makes us cry.
Be seeing you in every lovely summer's day, in everything that's light and gay. I'll always think of you that way. I'll find you in the morning sun, and when the night is new.
I won't forget when Peter Pan came to my house, took my hand. I said I was a boy, I'm glad he didn't check. I learned to fly, I learned to fight. I lived a whole life in one night. We saved each other's lives out on the pirate deck. And I remember that night when leaving a late night with some friends, and I hear somebody tell me it's not safe, someone should help me. Need to find a nice man to walk me home. When I was a boy, I scared the pants off of my mom.
So if people can see me sitting in the studio, I'm actually I've got my head cranked down and I'm kind of stamping my feet so I won't cry. and the last time this song was used on the show, it's a song by Dar Williams, whom you're about to hear from. The last time this song was used on the show, and I cannot remember the subject of the episode at all, because we've done several thousand shows. But we played the song, and I said in advance, this song often makes me cry, thinking I could probably hold it together live on the air. And I just turned into, it was a really bad one. I blubbered on the air. And I was kind of talking like that, the way you talk while you're crying. It was bad. Well, but one thing that I've learned is it's the end of the song that makes me cry. So that's why we are fading it right now. So Dar Williams, with that fairly psychotic sounding preamble. First of all, I'm very excited to talk to you, as I assume is clear at this point. I'm a big fan. Could you just say a little bit about the idea of people crying from your songs? I get the feeling I'm not the only person who has this reaction.
No, it's an interesting, I think it's a recognition thing. I think that moment of like, oh, I thought I was the only one, or something like that is what happens. Or I'm reminded that I'm not the only one, because sometimes people cry, over and over again when they go to people's concerts and hear that sound, that same song. So I think that basic recognition, I think in general, I think maybe a lot of the answers I would have to all questions about crying is that it gets to something very basic. And I think music, is really a great vehicle for getting the basic, sense of connection out there.
Yeah, my guess is it's not just one thing. And first of all, I think there's also a Pavlovian association that kind of gets going. Dar Williams' voice has made me cry once. Now when she sings The Babysitter's Here, or she and Joan Baez sing You're Aging Well, I'm in danger of crying again just because I think I've now, instead of salivating for a cracker, I cry when I hear your voice. But it's Pavlovian nonetheless. And so I think there's that. And I think also, to your point, quite a few of your songs, particularly that song and The Babysitter's Here, they're located in our childhood. And our childhood is something we have a lot of trouble accessing through any kind of deliberative, conscious thinking. You can sort of remember a thing, but you can't feel it. But for me, at the end, I don't even want to talk about this because I might start crying, but the guy says, I was a girl and I could talk to my mom and I could cry and things like that. And to me, that's what gets me. It's a set of feelings that I don't have access to any other way.
That is a great thing about music. Yes. And that's, frankly, I think we all hope for that thing where something just is so wonderful that it has such a direct access to your feelings that you just cry. It's so direct. And it's one of my favorite things about being a musician and hearing music.
So I'm assuming this happens to you. Well, first of all, does it just happen to you? Let's talk about the two ways it can happen. One of them is just while you're listening, and the other one is maybe while you're trying to sing one of somebody else's songs. Let's talk about the first one. Just listening, quietly to music. Does music move you to tears on a frequent basis?
Yes. It's probably the way that I find myself crying the most. But I actually, as I get older, I've noticed that it can be something very unexpected can do it. And it can just be in, stories and things that I recognize. The general connection to the world is sparked by a bunch of things. But I used to, people have said to me, and I've said to other people, when I need to cry, I know that I can go to your song. And actually, I covered two of them that made me cry. I had to control myself to record them. But it was great to say to Kat Goldman, the song Weight of the World not only made me cry, but it was a moment where I actually opened my heart in such a way where I continued to want to keep on performing for other people. So, music has definitely been some of the most powerful. But I'm sort of intrigued and excited about the fact that a lot of different things make me cry that I can't expect.
Yes. Well, as I think I might be a little bit older than you, and it's only going to get worse or better depending on how you process it. But yes, you'll be finding that, bank commercials make you cry. And I also, well, first of all, you also have to tell us, you told us one of the two songs that you've recorded that could conceivably make you cry. What's the other one?
The other one is Family by Pierce Pettis. That one is, it's very simple. The chorus says, "Let your love cover me like a pair of angel wings. You are my family, you are my family."
Let your love cover me like a pair of angel wings. You are my family. You are my family.
And I don't know what that is, but for a lot of people, it's very simple and it's a real surrender. It says, I'm giving my heart to you right now. You're my family, and I don't know what that is, but I had to. We had to cut a lot of times so I could control myself to record it.
Yeah, and I think also, I just got done with a show where that I wound up we had a poem by John O'Donohue, the Irish poet, at the end, and it made me think of something that he said on a radio show with Krista Tippett. He said, "Music is what language would love to be if it could," and I think we can't really unbraid this lanyard of music and lyrics. I mean, I think it's quite possible that the words to When I Was a Boy could be sung to a different tune and maybe by a different singer and have very little effect on me. This is really a thing where two or three aspects, the words, the music, and the voice come together, right? And do a kind of alchemy that you can't just isolate the words is what I'm saying.
I totally agree. And I think ideally what happens is, there's this interplay between the music and the lyrics as you're writing something. And, I lead a songwriting retreat and I talk about what I call the voice of the song. And the ideal is sort of that you're listening to, what the feel of those words and what the rhymes and the general language register is. And you're letting that inform the music, or you hear something cool in the music and you let that inform what lyrics you're writing, so that at the end you have a song where the music and lyrics are in that relationship with each other, plus you sing it in your voice's range so that to be a little bit more mellifluous, and then you can speculate that this song was sort of just meant to be as is. You sort of listen, you create and listen at every point of writing it.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that. There's that old adage about how country music is three chords and the truth. And I think that, no matter what it is, what we're creating, whether we're writing a song or a poem or a novel or anything, getting to the truth of something is maybe the main job. And when we get there, probably when you write these songs, you're thinking, yes, this is true in some way that I can't necessarily explain, but this is true. It might surprise you to find out how it will affect someone else emotionally. I'm assuming you don't finish these songs and go, well, people are going to really cry when they hear that one.
No. It's a complete mystery at this point. And it's also, it's different for other people. I have a song called The Christians and the Pagans.
Oh, yeah.
And someone came up to me and he'd just been at a march. Somebody had been, a gay young man had been beaten up. This was in the mid-'90s. And there was a vigil and march for him in Philadelphia. And the next day, this young man came to my concert and his friends led him backstage. They were all sort of teary-eyed. But he said, I am sobbing queer boy. And he said, to hear the Christians and the Pagans and to know that your introduction to the song is about, sort of this new holiday with all of the Christmas trimmings plus the arrival of the young lesbian relatives, and to be in this community that sort of sees this page turning was very emotional for me. And, and I got a sense that it always will be. So, those things happen too, where you find yourself situated in history, you hear a song and it gives you, again, I think it gave him a kind of a hope, and that brought tears.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that song, and that has made me cry too. I'm going to I sound like a blubbering idiot here, but
no.
and I think it's because also that's a very sneaky song, Dar, because it starts out kind of funny, right? Here's these Wiccan lesbians who are showing up at their much more traditional Christ-loving uncle's house, and then it really just become a whole song about family and about celebrating together and what's really important and kind of looking past individual doctrinal and identity differences. And that's a very clinical sounding way of saying it's a very, very warm and powerful song at the end. And you kind of trick us into thinking this is going to be a funny one, which it is. Yeah. But then you pull another string, and I can get why people might be crying.
That's a lovely expression. I pull another string. I think that's the other thing. And that string is just like that string in a chord that just makes that one kind of straight ahead major chord just a little bit different, one that plays on your brain chemicals a little bit differently. And in that case, in a lot of songs, there's this kind of an aha moment, a where are we going, what's really happening here. And I realized what was really happening was that there's things that we do in families that are actually a microcosm, so the last line.
Lighting trees in darkness, learning new ways from the old, and making sense of history and drawing warmth out of the cold.
I had to write this thing like overnight for a radio fundraiser. But I was like, oh yeah, see that it's not just about a dinner table. And I think that's what people said that they've responded to, is that I kind of put in the larger thing at the end, because not when families get along, that, worlds can get along.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. So if you are in a live setting, and I assume you don't cry from your own songs based on what I'm hearing, but maybe you're covering one of these other songs that might make you cry. Are you a kind of person, can you sing through that? Can you sing while you're crying?
Probably not.
Yeah.
I mean, so that's good. I once or twice, I have a song called The One Who Knows, and it's, about wanting to be there for your kids in a really supportive and not smothering, judgmental way. And, I was singing it once the summer that my son was going to college, sue me. And I felt that coming on, but I, suppressed it. And once I was singing a song called Oh Canada Girls, and I was in Canada, and I was just feeling all that energy, and I almost had to stop. And no, it tightens your throat, so you're screwed.
Your crying muscles and your singing muscles are very much at odds with one another. Although there are people, go and watch this afterwards if you want. But I mean, Bernadette Peters kind of famously can cry and sing at the same time. And there's a clip of her in particular, live and in concert. And I think it's not too long after her husband died, I think maybe in like a helicopter crash or something, and she's singing the Sondheim tune, Not a Day Goes By. And she just starts you just could see on her face and everything that she's crying, and the timbre of her voice changes a little bit. But she sings the crap out of the song.
Oh, that's fantastic.
While she's crying.
That's a skill. And you know what? I think that would be awesome, because for audiences to know how immediate it is for the artist, and in that cathartic way, not that that's a big rule, that people don't like to see people in actual pain on a stage, but to see, that happening in the moment for her must be, well, I think that, those Broadway people, they're just so good at that stuff.
Right.
I have yet to master it.
Yeah, no, it is kind of priced into the performance. Although watching that in particular, and I talked to her not too long after that, I mean, I think it is, they know how to inhabit a role, and if the person in that role is crying, that they can do that. But here she's clearly just crying for her own reasons, and I thought it was startling that she could do it, but and still sing like that. But I guess maybe one of my final questions here, we're talking to Dar Williams, by the way, is, if you look out into the audience, and I know a lot of the time you can't really see the audience if the light is on your face, but if you look out and see people crying, I don't know, talk a little bit about how that feels. You're singing, you're sharing, you've written something that you really do hope, I assume, will reach people. What's it like to see them out there crying?
You just actually hit on something. That's probably the closest I've ever come to crying, is when I see somebody crying in the audience. I'm pretty empathic. and so I think a little part of my brain's like, oh, no, don't look at that person. But it's a really, I have to say, it's very affirming, or I've seen people on every song, not even the ones that are the most, sentimental, holding hands, just quietly, they're both staring, and I just see these two hands sort of wander towards each other, and I feel like that's effective. They're sort of so in the music, and their bond is so much, linked to hearing music together, that they sort of automatically hold hands in the front row. Things like that show that we have all gotten to that place, that is beyond the sum of its parts, are as good as it's what any performer aspires to. I love hearing after the concerts that people have cried. And that's why I go out and sign CDs, so I can hear that.
Yeah, I think also there are different styles to all of this too. I mean, cabaret performers in particular, they kind of know that, I mean, part of their job really is to connect to the emotions of a song. There was a wonderful singer who died kind of young, Nancy Lamotte, who anytime I hear her sing like a Rodgers and Hammerstein song like I Have Dreamed or something, she just knows that that's what they do. I actually went to a cabaret conference one time for 35 singers came together to get more instructions. And when they weren't going to the conference, they were just like lying around the campus we were on, just crying and having these kind of Yeah, go ahead.
Folk singers aren't so far off from that. And I had a theater background, so I really love all those parts. I would say I was not the greatest actress, but I do understand, the ways that you can try to really be inside the song, the characters, the story, the moment that you're singing it, all of those things, like pulling in all those elements so that you're there.
Yeah.
You're really there. But yeah, we have a lot to learn from those songs and from those performers.
All right. So I'm being told by the producer that we have to wrap things up. It has been a privilege. And thank you so much for the music. Thanks for all of these songs. They've been so wonderful and certainly for decades now have been a part of my life. So Dar Williams, thanks for being here.
Thank you. You're going to make me cry.
That was the whole idea. That was totally manipulative on my part.
Thanks,
all right.
Colin.
Bye-bye. All right, the technical producer of this episode was the very great Kat Pastor. Our senior producer, Lily Tyson, is the producer of this particular episode. And you're about to hear something that's now called in the world of National Public Radio, the Lily Tyson pivot. They're teaching it in the schools now. So there's a term, crocodile tears, and it's been around a long time. And the idea that crocodiles cry when they eat. Crocodile tears, in case you don't know the trope, means essentially insincere tears, and it's based on the idea that when crocodiles are eating something, they're crying, which they obviously are not grief-torn over, probably. But it goes back to antiquity. It shows up in 4th century BCE stuff, Greco-Roman sources, Egyptian sources, and then all the way through history. Sometime around 1400, there are these explorations of Sir John Mandeville, I think is his name, and he describes these crocodiles who are serpents who chew up men, and they are weeping while they do it. And so the idea's just been around a lot, so much that you kind of think it couldn't be made up. Except in the 20th century, a lot of scientists started saying, what if it is made up? What if it's just a bunch of alligator poop? And that is where, in fact, our guest steps in. Ken Vliet recently retired from his position as coordinator of the laboratories at the University of Florida, is an expert in crocodilian biology, and he decided to kind of find out a little bit more about this. So first of all, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much, Colin.
And first, we should also say it was actually kind of a crossover concern about human patients, right? There's a kind of facial palsy where patients can involuntarily shed tears while they're chewing. And the question was, did this have anything to do with crocodiles, right?
Yeah, exactly. I was working with a fellow from UCLA named Malcolm Shaner, and he's interested in this crocodile tears syndrome in humans, in which they involuntarily cry when they're drinking or eating, and that got him interested in this anecdotal notion of crocodile tears. And so we started looking into this. This was a study we did many years ago, actually. I work closely with a zoo in Northeast Florida called the St. Augustine Alligator Farm Zoological Park, which is a fantastic place for crocodilians, which is the sole focus of my research. And they had a lot of animals that were trained to take food from keepers, allow close approach to the animals. And so we went over there and fed alligators and caiman and observed them closely, videotaped them, so forth, looking for the possible presence of tear production as they ate.
Right. So we should say harder to specifically study crocodiles because they eat underwater. So hard to tell whether there's any extra moisture in their eyes. But when it comes to studying prandial lacrimal ebullition, as most people call it instead of crocodile tears, you did it with these alligators. And it did seem, well, it didn't seem, it was almost universally present here that there would be a kind of bubbling in the eyes, right?
Yeah, we had because the animals were trained, we fed them on land, right? They prefer to eat in the water because the water helps them swallow their food. But we fed them on land so that we would be able to see any tear production if it did occur, and we saw it in most of the animals that we looked at. And sometimes this appears simply, as you might imagine, a little small droplet of liquid coming out of the corner of the eye and just kind of trailing down the side of the snout. But if the animals are agitated, either by our presence or by the presence of other crocodilians near them, they'll often hiss. And when you're feeding them and they start hissing, they'll often blow bubbles out of the corner of the eye, which is the liquids that coat the eye, just getting air blown into them, which seems odd, but in reptiles and in birds, the glandular secretions of the eye typically exit through what's called a lacrimal duct. And our lacrimal duct is where our tears are formed. But in the case of these animals, that actually empties out into the nasal sinuses within the snout of the animal. And so if you see anything, you normally see some liquid coming out of their nose, if they snort, you might see a spray of liquid coming out of their nostrils. But in this case, when they were feeding and they started hissing, that air would back up through that duct and cause the liquids forming in the corner of their eye to kind of bubble up. And it made it quite easy to see when they were doing it, when we were right close to them.
So the moral of the story is they're not sad and they're not pretending to be sad. We should also say that you're not the first person to try to study this, although my favorite person was the scientist who, in the past century, I think around 1972, decided to determine this by rubbing onion and salt into the eyes of crocodiles. Of course, that would be the famous scientist George One Hand Johnson. Don't do that with crocodiles. In fact, don't do any of this. This is one of these don't try this at home, kids, kind of experiments. But this has been fascinating. Ken Vliet is recently retired from his position as coordinator of laboratories at the University of Florida. He is an expert in crocodilian biology. And we hope you are an expert now in crying as well. Thanks for listening to this show. And I'm going to be taking off right now. Go have a good cry.
At a crocodile, never tip your hat and stop to talk a while. Never run, walk away, say good night, not good day. Clear the aisle and never smile at Mr. Crocodile. You may very well be well bred, lots of etiquette in your head. But there's always some special case, time or place, to forget etiquette. For example, one positively must not wear a pleased expression on his countenance when confronted with that large lizard-like amphibious reptile who has long jaws, armored skin, and webbed feet, and who is known as the crocodile. It has been discovered that one simply cannot cherish an amicable or trustworthy relationship with the aforementioned species. In addition, it is mandatory that one does not become irresistibly drawn into the erroneous belief that the lateral upward extension of his lips means that you are entirely welcome. It is much more reasonable to assume that he is contemplating how you would look in a lizard suit. His. Clear the aisle and never smile at Mr. Croc.